Somewhere in the Alabama River Valley, nestled between the cotton estates of Montgomery County and the Old Creek Territories, there exists a sealed courthouse record that local historians refuse to discuss. It contains the testimony of 7 enslaved people who described ceremonies they witnessed in the cellar of Willow Bend Plantation between March and September of 1845. Ceremonies that their mistress, Mrs. Helena Rutledge, conducted in complete darkness while speaking languages none of them recognized. When pressed by the magistrate about what Mrs. Rutledge was trying to accomplish with these gatherings, the testimonies became southwest disturbing that the court sealed the documents for 50 years, then extended that seal indefinitely. 3 of the witnesses disappeared from county records entirely within 6 months of giving their statements. What those 7 people saw in that cellar wasn't witchcraft or superstition. It was something far more calculating, rooted in obsessions that wealthy Southern women weren't supposed to possess, driven by knowledge that no plantation mistress should have acquired. Before we continue with the story of Helena Rutledge and the inexplicable events at Willow Bend Plantation, I need to ask you something important. If you're fascinated by historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and unspeakable truth, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know how far these forgotten American stories are reaching. Now, let's discover what really happened in that Alabama cellar and why the truth was so dangerous it had to be buried for generations. The truth about what happened at Willow Bend begins not with Helena Rutledge herself, but with the peculiar circumstances that brought her to Montgomery in the early autumn of 1843. Montgomery County in those years existed at a crossroads of old and new Alabama. The creek removal was still recent memory, the forced march westward having concluded less than a decade prior, and white settlers had claimed the richest bottomlands with the aggressive certainty of conquerors. Cotton ruled. Absolutely. The black soil stretching from the Alabama River produced yields that made men wealthy in a single season. And the town of Montgomery itself had transformed from a rough trading post into something approaching civilization with broad streets, a state house that smelled of fresh paint, and enough lawyers to argue property disputes for a generation. Willow Bend Plantation sat 7 miles southwest of town, positioned on a bend in the river, where the currents flowed and the water ran deep and dark. The estate encompassed nearly 800 acres, with 200 under cultivation, and the rest given over to old-growth forest that locals avoided after sunset. Not from superstition, but from the simple fact that creek burial grounds still dotted those woods, and disturbing the dead, any dead, seemed foolish even to practical men. The plantation house itself rose 3 stories, built of brick hauled up river from Mobile, with columns that gleamed white in the sun, and galleries that caught the evening breeze. 12 rooms on the main floor, 8 above. And beneath it all, a cellar that extended the full length of the structure, divided into storage chambers, a root cellar, and what the previous owner had called simply the wine room, though he'd stored little wine there, preferring to keep his more valuable bottles in a separate, smaller space under the kitchen. Samuel Rutledge had purchased Willow Bend in 1837, paying $32,000. An enormous sum that spoke to both the property's value and his own considerable wealth. He'd made his money in shipping, first in Charleston and later in Mobile, and he'd married Helena Prescott of Savannah in 1835 when she was 19 and he was 47. The marriage raised few eyebrows. Age gaps meant little when dowries were substantial and family connections valuable. Helena brought $6,000 in ties to one of Georgia's oldest families. Samuel brought wealth and a future. They moved to Willow Bend with 43 enslaved people, purchasing 20 more in Montgomery. to work the expanded cotton operation. Samuel hired an overseer, a thin man named Garrett Phelps, who'd worked plantations in Mississippi, and understood cotton and cruelty in equal measure. The operation ran efficiently, yields were strong, money accumulated. Then Samuel died in the spring of 1843, thrown from his horse while inspecting the southern fields, his neck broken so cleanly, the doctor said he felt nothing. Helena became a widow at 27, inheriting everything. The land, the house, the enslaved people, the cotton operation, and debts so minimal they barely mattered. Most widows in her position would have sold the property or remarried quickly. But Helena did neither. She dismissed Garrett Phelps 2 weeks after the funeral, paying him through the end of the month and telling him his services were no longer required. She interviewed 3 potential overseers and hired none of them. Instead, she announced to the enslaved community at Willowbend that she would manage the plantation herself. That work would continue as before, that she expected full effort and would tolerate no defiance. The arrangement was unusual, but not unprecedented. Several wealthy widows across the South maintained their own properties, proving themselves as capable as any man when it came to accounts and management. What made Helena different, what first planted seeds of unease among both the enslaved workers and the white families who'd welcomed her to Montgomery society, was the way she conducted herself in the months following Samuel's death. She spent hours in the plantation's small library, a room Samuel had filled with agricultural journals and legal texts, reading by lamplight until dawn. She rode the property alone, sometimes disappearing into the forested sections for entire afternoons. She began making trips to Montgomery 3 or 4 times weekly, visiting not the expected shops or social calls, but the offices of lawyers, the county clerk, and most strangely, a German cartographer named Wilhelm Breener, who'd recently settled in town and specialized in creating detailed property surveys and historical maps. The first ceremony occurred on the night of March 13, 1845. Though none of the enslaved people at Willowbend understood what they were witnessing until much later, when the pattern became undeniable, Esther, who worked in the main house as a cook, was the first to notice the preparation. Helena had ordered her to clean the large cellar chamber, the one called the wine room, though few bottles remained there now, and to do it thoroughly, scrubbing the brick floor and stone walls with lye soap until everything gleamed. When Esther asked if the mistress was planning to store something new down there, Helena simply said the space needed to be properly maintained and nothing more. The work took Esther and her daughter Celia 2 full days. The cellar was damp, the air heavy with the smell of earth and old brick. The chamber measured perhaps 30 feet long and 20 wide with a vaulted ceiling that made voices echo strangely. Small windows at ground level provided minimal light, and Esther had to work by lantern, which threw dancing shadows across the walls and made the space feel smaller than it was, more confined. On the evening of March 12, Helena instructed Esther to move 4 chairs into the cellar and arrange them facing each other in the center of the room. She was to bring no lamps, no candles, nothing that would provide light. When Esther expressed concern about working in darkness, Helena told her the arrangement was for guests who preferred privacy and that Esther shouldn't trouble herself with questions that didn't concern her. That night, near midnight, 3 women arrived at Willowbend in a covered carriage. Isaiah, who tended the stables, saw them arrive, but couldn't make out their faces in the darkness. They wore heavy cloaks despite the mild temperature, hoods drawn up, and they moved quickly from the carriage to the house without speaking. Helena met them at the door herself, unusual in itself, and led them not to the parlor or dining room, but directly to the cellar stairs. Celia was still awake in the cabin she shared with her mother, unable to sleep from a cough that had plagued her for weeks. She needed water and walked to the main house, approaching quietly, knowing that appearing at odd hours could invite punishment. She entered through the kitchen door, which was never locked, and stopped when she heard voices coming from below, from the cellar, muffled, but distinct. She shouldn't have gone closer. Every instinct told her to get her water and leave. But curiosity, that dangerous thing, pulled her to the cellar door, which stood slightly ajar, and she positioned herself where she could hear without being seen. 4 voices, all women speaking in low tones. Helena's she recognized immediately. The others were unfamiliar, though they carried the educated accents of wealth and position. They weren't praying, not in any way Celia recognized. The words were formal, measured, almost like a recitation, but in no language she'd ever heard. Not English, not French, not the scattered Spanish or Creek phrases she'd picked up from other enslaved people with different histories. Then Helena's voice, clear and commanding, "We bind ourselves to the purpose. We bind ourselves to the method. We bind ourselves to the future that will not be denied." The other voices echoed her words exactly, and then silence fell so complete that Celia thought perhaps they'd finished and would soon emerge. She should have fled then. Instead, she remained, and in that silence, she heard something else. A sound like pages turning, like multiple hands moving paper, and then a striking sound, metal on stone, regular and rhythmic, like the ticking of a great clock. The sound continued for what felt like an hour, but was probably no more than 15 minutes. Then Helena spoke again. This time in English. "The first mark is made. The first boundary is established. What we have begun will continue until the measure is complete." Celia left. Then, moving as quietly as she'd come, her water forgotten, she returned to the cabin and said nothing to her mother, but she couldn't sleep. And when dawn came, she felt as though she'd spent the night holding her breath. The 4 women emerged from the house just before dawn, their carriage departing quickly, and Helena appeared at breakfast as composed as ever, giving instructions for the day's work, as though nothing unusual had occurred. But Esther, serving coffee in the dining room, noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small mark on Helena's left wrist, like a brand or tattoo. A symbol that looked like 2 intersecting lines with a circle at their joining point, rendered in black ink, so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Throughout April and into May, the pattern established itself with disturbing regularity. Every 3 weeks, almost to the day, the covered carriage would arrive near midnight, bringing 3 women to Willowbend. They would spend hours in the cellar with Helena, their voices occasionally audible to anyone unfortunate enough to be near the house at that hour, speaking in that strange language, conducting whatever business drove them to meet in darkness and secrecy. The enslaved community at Willowbend began to talk among themselves carefully, always aware that conversations could be overheard and information used against them. Moses, who worked the cotton fields and had lived long enough to see patterns in white people's behavior, believed the women were conducting some kind of business arrangement, something they didn't want their husbands or fathers to know about. Women weren't supposed to own property independently in most cases, weren't supposed to conduct business without male oversight, and maybe these gatherings were simply wealthy women finding ways around legal restrictions. His theory made sense. It explained the secrecy without requiring belief in anything more sinister. But it didn't explain the marks that appeared gradually on the wrists of other women in Montgomery society. Marks identical to Helena's, small and dark and precise. Visible when their sleeves shifted or their gloves came off during social functions. Esther began noticing changes In Helena's behavior beyond the midnight meetings, the mistress spent increasing amounts of time in the library, but the books she read now were different. Volumes she'd acquired through some source Esther couldn't identify. Old books, their covers worn, their pages yellowed, written in languages Esther couldn't name. Helena had hired someone to teach her languages. That much became clear because she would occasionally read aloud, testing pronunciations, and the sounds weren't like any European tongue. In early May, Helena made another unusual decision. She selected 7 enslaved people from Willowbend: Esther, Celia, Moses, Isaiah, a young woman named Rachel who worked the vegetable gardens, a man named Thomas who maintained the equipment, and a boy of about 14 named Benjamin, and informed them that they would serve the house exclusively from now on, no field work. They would tend the main house, the immediate grounds, and attend to any needs Helena specified. Their quarters were moved closer to the main house into a long cabin that had previously stored equipment. The arrangement made them simultaneously privileged and vulnerable. Better food, lighter work, but also constant proximity to whatever Helena was doing, constant exposure to the gatherings, the preparations, the aftermath. It was Rachel who first noticed the changes in the cellar itself. Helena had ordered her to clean the space after one of the midnight meetings, and Rachel found things that hadn't been there before. Scratches on the brick floor in patterns that looked deliberate. Small piles of ash in the corners that smelled like burned paper. And strangest of all, the temperature of the room itself, which felt warmer than it should have, as though the stone walls held heat the way metal holds heat after being in sunlight. When Rachel mentioned the warmth to Moses, he told her to forget. She'd noticed it, to clean what she was told to clean and ask no questions. But Rachel was young, curious, and the mystery gnawed at her. She began paying closer attention during the daytime, watching Helena's movements, noting when the mistress made trips to town and what she brought back. One afternoon in late May, Rachel saw Helena return from Montgomery with a package wrapped in canvas roughly the size of a large book. Helena carried it directly to the library herself, not allowing anyone to help her, and Rachel later found the library door locked, which was unprecedented. The next midnight meeting occurred on June 3rd, and this time, Celia was deliberately positioned near the cellar door by her mother, who'd begun to worry that whatever was happening might eventually involve all of them, might eventually require them to participate or witness something they couldn't refuse without facing punishment. Better to know what they might face than to stumble into it blindly. Celia listened again, positioned in the darkness of the kitchen, where she could hear but not be seen. 5 voices, this time, not 4. Helena, and 4 visitors. The language was the same, that strange, not quite chanting that raised the hair on Celia's arms. But this time, there was something else, a smell that drifted up from the cellar, sharp and metallic, like iron left in water too long, like blood just beginning to oxidize. Then, in English, Helena spoke words that Celia would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. The second mark is made. The second boundary is established. We are closer to the completion than any who came before us. One of the other women responded, her voice carrying an emotion Celia couldn't quite identify. Excitement perhaps, or something close to religious fervor. How many remain? Helena's answer was simple, terrifying in its certainty. 7. 7 more and the work of 20 years will bear fruit. 7 more and everything they said was impossible will manifest in physical form. Summer heat settled over Montgomery County like a heavy hand. making the cotton fields shimmer in the afternoon sun and turning the river sluggish and low. The enslaved community at Willowbend worked through the heat as they always did, but now with an additional burden, the knowledge that something was building toward a conclusion. That Helena and her mysterious visitors were moving through some predetermined sequence of events, and that when they reached whatever end they sought, the consequences might extend beyond midnight meetings and strange languages. Moses took it upon himself to investigate more directly, knowing that his age and experience gave him some small protection, though protection could only extend so far when the person you were investigating owned you completely. He began watching Helena's trips to town more carefully, noting which buildings she visited and how long she stayed. The pattern that emerged was specific. Helena met regularly with Wilhelm Briner, the German cartographer, and these meetings lasted hours. She also visited a lawyer named Josiah Hammond and a doctor named Edward Finch, though she showed no signs of illness. Most intriguingly, she made monthly trips to a small print shop operated by a man named Cyrus Greenwald, a Massachusetts transplant who'd brought a printing press south and specialized in producing documents for legal practices and small publishing ventures. Moses couldn't follow Helena into these meetings, couldn't overhear the conversations, but he could observe the results. Helena often returned with papers, not just personal correspondence, but documents that looked official, printed materials, and occasionally items wrapped carefully that looked like they might be books or manuscripts. In July, Benjamin, the youngest of the 7 selected to work the main house, stumbled onto something that finally provided a concrete piece of the puzzle. He'd been tasked with organizing the library shelves, a job that required moving books, dusting, rearranging. Helena had left the room briefly, and Benjamin, who could read, despite the laws against teaching enslaved people literacy, his previous owner's children had taught him, secretly examined one of the volumes she'd been studying. The book was old. Its binding cracked, its pages brittle. The text was in English, but old English, the kind that required careful reading to understand. The title page, handwritten rather than printed, read, "A true account of the mysteries practiced by the women of the Carpathian territories and their methods for achieving influence beyond natural law. Compiled by Brother Augustine, year of our Lord 1721. Benjamin had time to read only a few pages before he heard Helena returning, but what he read stayed with him like a fever dream. The text described rituals conducted by groups of women across Eastern Europe. Women who discovered methods, not magical, the text insisted, but methodical, scientific in their way, for achieving specific outcomes through precise sequences of actions, words, and what the author called blood contracts. Though he seemed to mean something more symbolic than literal. The book described these women as operating in complete secrecy, passing their knowledge from generation to generation, never writing down the complete methods, but only fragments, ensuring that the full practice could be known only by those properly initiated. The purpose of their work, the book claimed, was to secure power and influence in societies that granted them neither, to create circumstances that would benefit them and their descendants across generations, to literally bind the future to their will through actions taken in the present. Benjamin replaced the book exactly as he'd found it and said nothing to Helena when she returned. But that evening, he told Moses what he'd read, and Moses shared it with Esther and the others. The revelation changed everything. Whatever Helena was doing wasn't simply unusual behavior or secret business arrangements. She was following some kind of method, some system she believed would produce specific results. And the midnight meetings were part of that system, stages in a process that required multiple participants and careful timing. The question that haunted all of them now was simple and terrible. What exactly was Helena trying to achieve? And what role, if any, would they be forced to play in achieving it? The August meeting brought 5 women again. And this time Isaiah managed to position himself near one of the ground-level windows that opened into the cellar. The glass was old and warped, and he couldn't see clearly, but he could make out movement, shapes in the darkness, because the women had finally brought light. Not lamps or candles, but something else, a phosphorescent glow. That didn't flicker like flame, but remained steady, cold, blue-white. In that strange light, Isaiah saw the 5 women seated in a circle, their hands joined, and in the center of the circle, a large book open on a stand. Helena was reading from it, and the others were responding, their voices creating a rhythm, a pattern, a sound that made Isaiah's teeth ache even though he was outside, separated by glass and distance. Then Helena produced a knife, small and silver, and Isaiah thought with cold certainty that this was the moment when whatever they were doing would cross into something truly horrifying. But Helena didn't harm anyone. Instead, she pressed the blade against her own palm, letting blood well up, and she allowed 3 drops to fall onto the open pages of the book. Each of the other women did the same. 3 drops. Each, 15 drops total, the blood disappearing into the paper as though absorbed, leaving no stain, no mark. Helena's voice carried clearly through the glass. The 6th mark is made. The 6th boundary is established. We approach the completion that will secure for us and our daughters what no law and no man will grant. We approach the moment when property and power will pass through our hands and remain there, unbreakable, undeniable. Isaiah left his position, feeling sick. Not from the blood, he'd seen far worse than a few drops, but from the certainty in Helena's voice, the absolute conviction that what she was doing would work, that it wasn't madness or delusion, but a practical action with practical consequences. September brought cooler evenings and a tension at Willowbend that felt almost physical, like humidity before a storm. Helena's behavior grew more intense, more focused. She spent entire days in the library, emerging only to give brief instructions before disappearing again. She stopped attending church, stopped receiving social calls, stopped maintaining even the minimal pretense of normal widow's mourning behavior. The Montgomery community noticed. Whispers circulated about Helena Rutledge and her strange seclusion, about the women who visited her estate in darkness, about the marks some of them bore on their wrists. But whispers were only whispers, and Helena was wealthy, and wealthy. Eccentricity was tolerated where poor eccentricity would have been punished. Esther overheard a conversation in early September that filled in more of the picture. 2 of the visiting women had arrived earlier than usual, near dusk, rather than midnight, and they'd spoken in the parlor before descending to the cellar. Esther, serving tea she knew wouldn't be drunk, heard them discussing legal documents, property transfers, inheritance laws. One of the women, her voice sharp with frustration, said, "My husband's brother claims he has right to the timberlands under the old deed. His lawyer says my father's will is unclear." Helena responded with cold certainty. "When we complete the 7th mark, such claims will fail. The binding ensures it. Property that passes through our hands, through blood connection or direct transfer, becomes ours in ways that transcend legal interpretation. It has worked for those who came before us. It will work for us." The second woman asked, "And you're certain of the timing?" "Certain that September 21st is correct." Helena's answer came without hesitation. "The calculations are precise." Wilhelm confirmed the alignments. The 21st is the proper date, the only date in the next decade where the conditions align. Lunar phase, planetary positions, the anniversary of The first mark we made in March. Everything must be exact. The method is scientific, not supernatural. It follows natural law we simply don't yet understand. Esther continued serving as though she'd heard nothing, but her hands trembled slightly, and when she left the room, she went directly to Moses and repeated every word. The seventh and final meeting was scheduled for September 21st, just 2 weeks away. Whatever Helena and her group intended to accomplish, whatever they believed this process would achieve, the culmination was imminent. And now the 7 enslaved people who'd been brought into close proximity with Helena's activities faced an impossible question. Should they try to intervene, try to warn someone in town about what was happening, risk the absolute certainty of brutal punishment for interfering in white people's affairs? Or should they remain silent, complicit through inaction, and hope that when whatever was going to happen finally happened, it wouldn't consume them as well? Moses gathered the 7 of them on the evening of September 8th in the cabin they shared, speaking in whispers, even though Helena rarely left the main house after dark anymore. "We can't stop her," Moses said bluntly. "Even if we tried, even if we went to the sheriff or the magistrate, who would believe us? We're enslaved people testifying against a wealthy white woman about ceremonies and blood contracts and books from Europe. They'd punish us for lying or for causing trouble or simply for speaking above our station." Rachel shook her head. "Then we just watch. Just let whatever's going to happen happen. We document it," Esther said quietly. "We remember every detail. We make ourselves witnesses in a way that can't be dismissed later, if later comes and matters." Thomas, who rarely spoke up, added, "And we prepare to run if running becomes necessary. We note where horses are kept, where supplies are stored. We make ourselves ready to survive whatever this brings." They agreed to this plan. Such as it was, born not from courage, but from the absolute lack of better options. They would observe, remember, and survive, in that order. The days between September 8th and September 21st felt simultaneously endless and too brief. Helena made final preparations. Receiving deliveries from town, cleaning the cellar herself rather than delegating the work, spending hours checking and rechecking documents and calculations that none of them could see. On September 19th, 2 days before the final ceremony, Helena did something unprecedented. She gathered all 7 of them in the main hall and spoke to them directly, her voice carrying an edge of something that might have been excitement or might have been fear. "What I'm going to ask you might seem strange," Helena began. "But I need you to understand that what happens on the 21st is important, more important than anything you've witnessed before. I need all of you to remain in your quarters that night. Don't approach the main house. Don't attempt to observe or interfere. What we're doing is delicate, and any disruption could have serious consequences." She paused, studying each of their faces. "I've always treated you fairly. I've never used the lash, never sold families apart, never been anything but reasonable in my demands. I'm asking you now to trust that what I'm doing serves a greater purpose, one you can't fully understand, but that doesn't threaten you. Can you give me that trust?" Just when the silence stretched too long, Moses nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We'll stay in our quarters." Helena seemed to relax slightly. "Good. After the 21st, things will return to normal. You have my word." She dismissed them, and they returned to their cabin. And none of them believed for a moment that things would return to normal, but they'd said what she needed to hear, and now they would do what they needed to do. The night of September 21st, 1845. Arrived with perfect weather, cool, dry, with a moon 3 days past full that provided enough light to see clearly, but not enough to feel exposed. The 7 of them remained in their cabin as instructed, but they kept the windows open, kept their ears sharp, kept themselves ready for whatever might come. The evening before had brought an unexpected development. Helena had summoned Esther alone to the main house, asking her to prepare a specific meal for the following day, not for the midnight visitors, but for Helena herself. The menu was precise. Chicken roasted with herbs Helena specified by their Latin names, bread made with a particular type of flour she'd had shipped from Charleston, vegetables prepared in exact quantities, and a tea brewed from leaves Helena provided in a sealed container. Leaves that smelled of mint and something darker, more medicinal. The timing matters, Helena had told Esther, her voice carrying an intensity that made the cook uncomfortable. I need to consume this meal at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, 3 hours before the others arrive. The preparation has been 20 years in planning, Esther. 20 years. Of study, of gathering knowledge, of finding others who understood what I understood. Everything must be exact. Esther had prepared the meal as instructed, watching as Helena consumed every bite with ritualistic precision. Checking a pocket watch between courses, measuring even the speed at which she ate. When finished, Helena had thanked her, an unusual gesture, and told her to take the rest of the evening for herself, that no one would be needed in the main house until morning. Now, waiting in the cabin as night deepened. Esther shared this detail with the others, and Moses frowned, trying to piece together what it might mean. She's preparing herself, he said slowly, like someone preparing for battle or for an ordeal. Whatever happens tonight, she needs to be in a specific state, physical and mental, Thomas added. Or she believes she does. Might be she's read in one of those old books that you need to eat certain things before conducting ceremonies, and she's following instructions that mean nothing at all, or they mean everything. Rachel countered, and we're about to see whether all this preparation, all these months of meetings and blood and strange languages, produce something real or reveal themselves as elaborate pretending. The covered carriage arrived at 11:30. Bringing 5 women as expected. Isaiah, watching from the cabin window, counted them as they descended. 5 hooded figures moving quickly to the main house where Helena awaited at the door. 6 total. 6 women conducting the final ceremony of a process that had occupied them for 6 months, that they believed would secure them power and property through methods no law recognized, but that they insisted followed natural principles. But this time something was different. The women didn't enter the house immediately. They gathered in a tight circle on the front steps, and even from a distance, Isaiah could hear them speaking, not in the strange language they used in the cellar, but in English, their voices carrying an edge of nervousness, of anticipation. One woman's voice rose slightly. Are you certain of the calculations, Helena? Certain that tonight is the proper convergence? Helena's response came clear and confident. Wilhelm checked them 3 times. The lunar phase, the planetary positions, the precise number of days since we made the first mark. Everything aligns tonight in a way that won't occur again for another 19 years. If we don't complete the binding now, everything we've done becomes meaningless. The method requires exact timing. There's no room for doubt. The women entered the house then, and for the next 30 minutes, the 7 watchers in the cabin saw lights moving through the main floor, brief flashes of lamplight in different windows, suggesting the women were gathering materials, making final preparations. Then the lights descended, moving toward the cellar, and darkness reclaimed the house. Midnight came and went. No sound emerged from the house. No light showed in any window. The night remained perfectly still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. But in the cabin, Benjamin began to feel something strange, a pressure in his ears, like the feeling before a thunderstorm, and a taste in his mouth like copper. He mentioned it quietly to Moses, who frowned and asked if anyone else felt it. They all did. A subtle wrongness in the air, a sensation that was probably nothing more than their own nervous tension manifesting physically, but that felt like something external. Something pressing in on them from the direction of the main house. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Celia whispered that she needed to know what was happening, that the uncertainty was worse than any punishment. Before anyone could stop her, she slipped out of the cabin and moved toward the main house, staying in shadows, approaching the cellar window, where Isaiah had watched during the August ceremony. The others followed, unable to let her go alone, unable to remain in ignorance any longer. They reached the cellar window together, 7 faces pressed close to the warped glass, looking down into the space they'd cleaned and prepared dozens of times. What they saw was simultaneously mundane and terrifying in its implications. 6 women seated in a circle, hands joined, eyes closed, the strange blue-white light illuminating them, source invisible, the large book open in the center of their circle, and now they could see it was covered in writing, dense text in multiple languages, pages marked with what looked like dates and notations. But there were other things in the circle now, things that hadn't been present in previous ceremonies. 7 candles arranged in a specific pattern around the book. A bowl that looked like it might be silver or pewter, and papers. Dozens of papers scattered across the floor, each covered in writing. Helena was speaking, her voice carrying clearly despite the glass. And now they realized she'd been speaking for some time, following some script or recitation that had begun before they'd arrived at the window. And as those before us established boundaries through will and word and witness, so we establish our own. Claiming what the law denies us, securing what society refuses to grant, binding ourselves to outcomes that transcend individual mortality and extend through generations yet unborn. One of the other women picked up the recitation seamlessly. We do not ask for divine intervention. We do not petition supernatural forces. We engage with natural law as it truly exists, not as common men perceive it. We create resonance between intention and outcome through methods that ancient practitioners discovered and recorded, methods that work not through magic, but through precise application of principle. A third woman continued, the blood we offer is symbolic but potent. The words we speak are deliberate and tested. The timing we honor is calculated through astronomical observation and historical precedent. What we do here is science, not sorcery. It is method, not miracle. And it will work because those who came before us proved that it works, that human will applied with sufficient focus and proper technique can shape probability itself. Helena opened her eyes, though the other women kept theirs closed, and she reached for the silver knife that lay beside the book. But before she could take it, one of the women, the one Esther had heard called Catherine Drummond, spoke urgently, "Wait, I need to know we're all committed. Once we make this 7th mark, once we complete the binding, there's no undoing it. The old texts are clear on that point. We bind ourselves as much as we bind the future. Our property becomes linked to this circle. Our descendants become part of the pattern. If any of us has doubts, speak them now." A moment of heavy silence. Then Sarah Vaughan, whose voice they'd heard before, said, "I have no doubts. My father's estate will pass to my daughter or it will be contested until nothing remains. The law gives me no protection. This method offers what the law denies. I'm committed. Each woman in turn affirmed their commitment. And Helena nodded with satisfaction. Then we proceed. With this seventh mark, we bind ourselves complete. With this seventh boundary, we establish permanence. Let the property we claim remain in our hands and the hands of our daughters. Let the wealth we accumulate remain untouchable. Let the power we secure remain absolute, bound not by supernatural force, but by the natural law of cause precisely meeting consequence. Let what we establish tonight echo forward through generations, creating circumstances that benefit those who share our blood and our purpose. She opened her eyes fully now, picked up the knife, and made the small cut across her left palm, deeper than in previous ceremonies, enough that blood welled immediately, dripping steadily rather than just beading. She held her hand over the open book and let the blood fall, counting aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 drops instead of 3. Each woman did the same. 7 drops each. 42 drops total. The blood disappearing into the pages as before, but leaving behind something new. A faint shimmer on the paper as though the blood had reacted with something in the ink or the parchment itself, creating a luminescence that lasted several seconds before fading. Helena reached into the bowl in the center of the circle and removed something small. The watchers couldn't see clearly what it was, but it looked like a piece of jewelry or a small metal object. She held it up and the other women each produced similar items from their own persons. These tokens represent our physical connection to the properties we claim, Helena said, her voice taking on a formal, almost liturgical quality. Each inscribed with the legal description of land or assets we seek to bind to ourselves. We place them now in the foundation of this binding, anchoring the abstract to the material. She placed her token on the book's pages directly where her blood had fallen. The other women did the same, arranging their tokens in a pattern around the central text. Then Helena produced a small hammer, silver like the knife, and tapped each token. Once, the sound ringing clear in the cellar's confined space. By metal to metal, by blood to intention, by word to outcome, we forged the binding, she said. Then she picked up one of the papers from the floor and began reading from it in that strange language they'd heard before. The not quite Latin, not quite anything else tongue that made the watcher's teeth ache even through the glass. The other women joined her, reading from their own papers in unison, their voices creating a sound that was more vibration than speech, more felt than heard. The blue-white light intensified, and for a moment, just a moment, the air in the cellar seemed to warp, to bend like heat shimmer on a summer road, creating distortions around the seated women that made them appear to flicker in and out of solidity. Then it stopped. The light dimmed back to its previous level. The women fell silent. And Helena closed the book with a sharp snap that echoed in the cellar, and she said simply, "It is done. The method is complete. The binding is established. Now we wait for the manifestation, which the texts promise will become evident within 6 lunar cycles. By the new moon of March next year, we will see the first confirmations. By this time next year, the pattern will be undeniable." One of the women asked, her voice shaky. "And if nothing happens? If the manifestation doesn't occur?" Helena's answer was cold, certain. "Then those who came before us were liars or fools, and we've wasted 6 months following a method that has no substance." But I don't believe that. I've studied too much, verified too many historical accounts of women who used these techniques and secured fortunes, established dynasties, protected their daughters from dispossession. This works. It has always worked. It will work for us. The 6 women sat in silence for perhaps 10 minutes. And in that silence, nothing dramatic occurred. No flash of light, no sound, no visible change in the cellar or the world around it. Just 6 women sitting in a circle, waiting for something that might or might not be real, that might be delusion or might be a manipulation of principles they'd found in old books and believed they could apply with scientific precision. But something had changed, something subtle that the 7 watchers couldn't quite identify. The air felt different. Less oppressive, as though whatever pressure they'd felt building through the night had released. The copper taste in their mouths faded. The wrongness dissipated, leaving behind only normal September night air, cool and clean. Finally, Helena stood and the others followed. They gathered their papers carefully, placing them in leather cases they'd brought. Helena retrieved the tokens from the book's pages, distributing them back to their owners. She closed and locked the book, securing it with a small brass padlock. Then they gathered their cloaks, extinguished the strange light, revealing it to be some kind of chemical lamp, nothing supernatural, just phosphorus or a similar substance that created cold light, and began moving toward the cellar stairs. The 7 watchers at the window fled back to their cabin, arriving just seconds before they heard the main house door open and the women emerge. They pressed themselves against the cabin walls, barely breathing, listening to the footsteps on the gravel drive, the rustle of fabric, the low murmur of voices. Remember, Helena's voice carried across the distance. We speak of this to no one outside our circle. Not to husbands, not to confidants, not even to our own daughters until they reach an age where they can understand and be trusted. The method works best in secrecy. Exposure weakens the binding. When do we gather again? Someone asked. Not for 6 months. Not until we can assess whether the manifestation is occurring as predicted. Watch your property cases, your inheritance situations, your business dealings. Document anything unusual. Anything that seems to resolve in your favor against reasonable odds. We'll compare results in March and determine whether we need to reinforce the binding or if the initial establishment holds. The carriage departed quickly, as always. And the night returned to normal stillness. Inside the cabin, the 7 of them sat in shocked confusion, because what they'd witnessed was simultaneously exactly what they'd expected, and somehow far less dramatic, far less conclusive than they'd imagined. That's it. Rachel whispered. That's what all this was building toward. Just blood and words and waiting. Tokens and papers and promises that something will happen eventually. Moses shook his head slowly. Maybe that's all it ever was. Maybe. Helena and those women believe in something that doesn't exist. Believe their blood and words can bind the future. And maybe they're just wealthy people playing at power because they have nothing better to do. Rich people do strange things when they have too much time and too much fear of losing what they have. But Esther, older and more cautious, said, or maybe we can't see the results yet. Maybe whatever they think they did, whatever they believe they accomplished, won't show itself immediately. Maybe the proof they're waiting for takes time to manifest. They said 6 lunar cycles, Celia said. Until March. Maybe we need to wait and watch, like they're going to wait and watch. Still shaken from what she'd witnessed, Celia added, did you see how certain Helena was? How convinced? She's not stupid. She's educated. She's read extensively. She's consulted with that German cartographer and lawyers and whoever else. If she believes this strongly that the method works, maybe we should consider that she knows something we don't. Or, Thomas countered, maybe education and intelligence don't protect you from believing things that make you feel powerful when you actually feel powerless. Maybe all her reading just gave her elaborate ways to pretend she has control over things nobody can control: property law, inheritance courts, the future itself. Benjamin, who'd been quiet, finally spoke. I read some of that book in the library, remember? It talked about women in Europe using these methods for centuries. It described results, specific cases where women secured property against impossible odds, where fortunes stayed in female hands despite laws against it. Those cases were documented, verified by people at the time. Either those documents are forgeries, or something about the method actually produces outcomes. But how? Rachel pressed. How could blood drops and strange words affect property cases and inheritance courts? That doesn't make sense. Moses thought for a long moment before answering. Maybe it doesn't affect them directly. Maybe the ceremony is psychological. Maybe by performing these rituals, by binding themselves to this belief system, the women become more focused, more coordinated, more willing to push boundaries and take risks. Maybe the magic isn't in the blood and words. Maybe it's in what the rituals make them believe about themselves, and how that belief changes how they act in the real world. It was a rational explanation, one that required no supernatural elements, no violation of natural law. But it didn't entirely explain the shimmer they'd seen in the cellar air, the way the blood had seemed to react with the book's pages, the sensation of pressure building and releasing. Unless those things were imagined, products of their own nervous tension and expectation, seeing what they thought they should see rather than what was actually there. None of them slept that night. They waited for dawn. Waited for some sign that the world had changed or remained the same. Waited for Helena to emerge from the house and confirm that her ritual, her method, her careful work across 6 months had achieved whatever goal she'd set. Helena appeared at breakfast looking exhausted but satisfied, like someone who'd completed a difficult task successfully. She gave normal instructions for the day's work, showed no indication that anything unusual had occurred, treated the 7 of them exactly as she always had, fairly, if such a word could apply to people she owned. But there was something new in her bearing, a confidence that hadn't been present before, or perhaps had been there but was now more pronounced. She moved through the house as though she owned it in a way that transcended legal documents, as though her connection to Willowbend had deepened overnight into something more fundamental than mere property rights. Days passed, weeks, the cotton harvest proceeded as always, the work continuing in rhythms established long before Helena's ceremonies began. She returned to occasional social engagements, resumed attending church, began accepting visitors during normal hours. The midnight meetings ended completely. The cellar returned to storing food and supplies, and Willowbend plantation settled back into routines that looked from the outside entirely normal. But the 7 witnesses watched carefully, noting small changes that might have meant nothing individually, but collectively created a pattern that troubled them deeply. In early October, a letter arrived from Savannah that sent Helena into a state of visible excitement. Esther, serving tea in the parlor when Helena opened the correspondence, heard her mistress let out a small gasp of satisfaction. The letter, which Helena later discussed with a visiting lawyer, concerned a distant cousin who died unexpectedly, leaving a will that named Helena as heir to a commercial property in Savannah's waterfront district, prime land that generated substantial rental income. The inheritance wasn't particularly surprising, distant relatives died and left money to other relatives all the time. What was strange was Helena's reaction when the lawyer expressed surprise that she'd been included in the will at all, given that she'd never met this cousin, and there were closer relatives who might have expected the bequest. Some things are meant to be, Helena had said simply, with a certainty that made the lawyer uncomfortable enough to gather his papers quickly and make his exit. In mid-October, Moses overheard a conversation between Helena and Wilhelm Briner, the German cartographer, who'd come to deliver some map she'd commissioned. They spoke in the library, their voices carrying into the adjacent hallway where Moses was supposedly polishing the banister. The alignment was perfect, Briner was saying, his German accent thick, but his English clear. I have checked the calculations 4 times since our last meeting. The planetary positions on September 21st were exactly as predicted, and they will not occur in that precise configuration again in our lifetimes. Whatever you intended to accomplish, Mrs. Rutledge, you chose the optimal moment. Helena's response was measured. And the historical precedents, the cases I asked you to research in the European archives, did you find corroboration? I found 13 documented cases across 3 centuries, Briner replied. And Moses could hear papers rustling as the cartographer presumably showed Helena his findings. Women who performed similar ceremonies and subsequently experienced remarkable fortunes. Property passing to them despite legal challenges. Business ventures succeeding against considerable odds. Inheritance disputes resolving in their favor in ways that contemporary observers described as improbable but not impossible. Of course, one could argue these were simply fortunate coincidences, but the pattern is striking. Coincidence is what people call pattern when they lack the courage to acknowledge design, Helena said. Thank you, Wilhelm. Your research has been invaluable. Send me your final invoice and I'll settle it promptly. After Briner left, Moses shared this conversation with the others, and they tried to make sense of it. 13 cases across 3 centuries. Was that evidence of something real, or just the expected number of fortunate women one might find if one searched through enough historical records looking for examples that fit a predetermined pattern? November brought the first truly startling development. Mrs. Catherine Drummond, one of the women who'd participated in the ceremonies, won a legal case against her late husband's business partner, securing full control of a shipping company that everyone expected her to lose. The Montgomery newspapers covered the case extensively, noting that the judge's ruling seemed to contradict several precedents, and that Mrs. Drummond's lawyers had presented documentation that was surprisingly comprehensive and legally airtight, as though they'd anticipated every possible challenge years in advance. Rachel, who could read and often reviewed discarded newspapers from the main house, brought this article to the others and read it aloud. It says here that the judge seemed almost reluctant to rule in her favor, but found himself unable to identify any legal basis for denying her claim. It's like the case built itself, like every piece fell into place without human effort. Or, Thomas suggested, like Mrs. Drummond hired excellent lawyers and spent years preparing for exactly this situation, documenting everything meticulously so that when the case finally went to court, she had irrefutable evidence on her side. That's not magic. That's planning. But the timing bothered them. The case had been decided on November 3rd, exactly 6 lunar cycles after the final ceremony, precisely when Helena had said they'd begin to see manifestations. One coincidence could be dismissed, but if more followed, they didn't have to wait long. In mid-November, Sarah Vaughn, another ceremony participant, announced that her daughter would inherit her father's entire estate. Despite having 3 brothers, a circumstance so unusual that it became gossip throughout Montgomery society. The will was old, properly executed, and entirely legal, written in a way that somehow avoided the standard primogeniture expectations. The 7 witnesses compared notes and dates. Mrs. Vaughan's inheritance announcement came on November 17th, again within the 6-cycle window Helena had specified. The pattern was becoming undeniable. But what did it prove? That Helena and her circle had successfully predicted when their careful planning would bear fruit, or that something about the ceremony itself had influenced outcomes in ways that transcended normal causation. December brought 3 more developments, each involving women they now knew had participated in the ceremonies. A property dispute resolved unexpectedly. A business loan approved despite questionable collateral. A contested guardianship decided in favor of a mother rather than her late husband's male relatives. By January of 1846, all 6 women who participated in the ceremony seemed to be benefiting from extraordinary legal and financial circumstances, property disputes resolving in their favor, inheritances appearing unexpectedly, business ventures succeeding beyond reasonable odds, and none of it attributable to anything except excellent fortune and careful planning, unless one believed that ceremony and blood and words spoken in darkness could somehow tip probability in specific directions, could create circumstances that benefited the practitioners at the expense of natural randomness. Unless one accepted that human will, applied with sufficient focus and proper technique, could shape outcomes in ways that looked like luck, but were actually something more deliberate. The 7 enslaved people at Willow Bend watched these developments and wrestled with an impossible question. What had they really witnessed? A group of intelligent, frustrated women using elaborate theater to give themselves confidence and focus, or something darker, a method that actually worked, despite violating everything they understood about how the world functioned. Esther finally articulated what they were all thinking. Maybe it doesn't matter whether it's real or pretending. Maybe the important thing is that it works, that Helena and those women are getting what they wanted, securing property and power that the law said they couldn't have. Whether they did it through magic or through psychology and careful planning doesn't change the outcome. But it matters for us, Moses argued. If what they did was just ceremony and planning, then we can tell people about it without sounding insane. But if what they did was something else, something that actually bent probability through ritual, then who would believe us? And even if someone did believe us, what would they do about it? Make ceremonies illegal? Punish women for speaking strange words? And dropping blood on books? They had no answers, only observations and growing unease. Helena seemed to grow more confident with each passing month, as though the manifestations confirmed beliefs she'd harbored for years. She began hosting other women at Willow Bend. Not for midnight ceremonies, but for afternoon gatherings that looked perfectly normal, tea and conversation and needlework, but that sometimes included whispered discussions the household staff couldn't quite overhear. In March of 1846, exactly 6 months after the final ceremony, Helena gathered Catherine Drummond and Sarah Vaughan at Willow Bend for what appeared to be a social visit. But Celia, serving refreshments in the parlor, heard them discussing results, comparing outcomes, documenting how many of their hoped-for manifestations had actually occurred. 11 of 13, Catherine was saying, her voice carrying satisfaction. 11 properties or financial arrangements resolved in my favor since September. The probability of that occurring through chance alone is vanishingly small. 9 of 11 for me, Sarah added. And the 2 that haven't resolved yet are still pending, still might manifest as predicted. Helena smiled, a rare expression that transformed her usually severe features. 14 of 15. For me. The method works just as the texts promised. Just as those before us proved. We've established a binding that will benefit our daughters and our daughters' daughters. We've secured something that no law and no man can take from us. Should we perform another ceremony? Catherine asked. Reinforce the binding. Helena shook her head. The texts are clear. Reinforcement is unnecessary if the initial establishment was done correctly. And clearly it was. We'll continue to meet, continue to coordinate, continue to support each other's interests. But the ceremonial work is complete. What we've bound remains bound. Celia reported this conversation to the others, and they realized with cold certainty that Helena and her circle believed absolutely in the efficacy of their method. Whether that belief was justified or delusional didn't change the fact that they'd achieved remarkable results and attributed those results to ceremonies performed in darkness with blood and books and words from dead languages. The question that haunted the 7 witnesses now was, what should they do with this knowledge? Should they remain silent, protecting themselves from the inevitable punishment that would come from speaking out against wealthy white women? Or should they find a way to document what they'd seen, to create a record that might someday help someone understand what had happened at Willow Bend? Moses made the decision in April of 1846. We write it down, he said. Every ceremony, every detail we remember, every development that followed. We write it down and we hide it. And someday, when circumstances allow, we make sure someone who matters sees it. Most of us can't write, Rachel pointed out. But Benjamin can, Moses said, and I can a little, enough. We'll work together. Create a document that tells the truth about what we witnessed. It might never matter, but if it does, if someone ever wants to know what really happened here, they'll have more than just rumors and whispers. They worked on the document for 2 months, meeting in secret, Benjamin doing most of the writing with corrections and additions from Moses, and occasional details from the others. They hid the pages under a loose floorboard in their cabin, adding to them whenever a new development seemed relevant. But in June, their secret documentation nearly caused disaster. Helena, conducting an unexpected inspection of the quarters, discovered the hidden pages. She read them silently, her face showing no emotion. While the 7 of them stood frozen in terror, certain that they'd just sealed their fates. When Helena finally spoke, her voice was surprisingly calm. You think you understand what you witnessed. You think you've documented something that matters. But you don't understand. And you can't. The method I used has been practiced for centuries by women who had no other recourse, no other means of securing their futures against laws and systems designed to dispossess them. What I did was no more sinister than what lawyers do when they find loopholes in statutes. No more supernatural than what doctors do when they apply scientific principles most people don't understand. She paused, looking at each of them in turn. I'm not angry that you watched. I knew you would. I'm not even angry that you wrote it down. But I am disappointed that you've turned natural methodology into something it's not. The binding I established works through psychology and probability, through careful planning and mutual support among women who refuse to be denied. There's no magic in it. Nothing that violates the laws of nature, just human will applied with scientific precision. She burned the pages they'd written, watching until every word turned to ash. You'll tell no one about what you saw. Not because I'm worried they'll believe you, they won't, but because I prefer not to have rumors circulating that might make my Social position difficult. In return, I'll continue to treat you fairly, as I always have. That's my offer. Accept it or face consequences that won't benefit anyone. They accepted. Of course, they had no choice. But Esther, emboldened by the fact that Helena hadn't immediately resorted to violence, asked one question. Did it work? The ceremony, the binding. Did it really work? Helena smiled slightly. Look at my circumstances now versus a year ago. Look at the circumstances of the women who participated with me. Draw your own conclusions. Just remember that correlation isn't causation. And sometimes the most powerful magic is simply refusing to accept limitations others try to impose. She left them with that ambiguity, that careful non-answer that could mean anything or nothing. And they lived with the knowledge they couldn't prove, couldn't share, couldn't act on, except to remember, and to wonder.